On the afternoon of July 6, 1944, thousands of families spread across the American Northeast were doing exactly what families do in the middle of summer. They were looking for something wonderful. The war was still on. Boys who had grown up in those neighborhoods were somewhere in France, somewhere in the Pacific, somewhere far enough away that their absence was a physical thing, a chair at the table, a silence at dinner, a name that got mentioned carefully. Rationing was real. Worry was constant. The particular exhaustion of a country that had been holding its breath for 3 years had settled into everyday life in a way that people didn't talk about much because everyone was feeling it, and talking about it didn't help. And then the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus came to Hartford, Connecticut. The greatest show on earth. That was not a marketing phrase. That was a genuine article of faith for millions of American children who had grown up with the circus as the single most spectacular thing that could possibly happen to an ordinary town on an ordinary Thursday. The animals, the acrobats, the clowns, the trapeze artists who made gravity look like a suggestion, the big top tent going up on the edge of town like a cathedral made of canvas, promising something that the real world, in July of 1944, was not currently offering. Something purely and completely joyful. By 2:40 in the afternoon, that tent was fully involved in fire. By the time it was over, 168 people were dead. More than 700 were injured. And the majority of the dead were children. The Ringling Circus was the largest traveling show in America, and its operation was a logistical miracle by the standards of the era. Hundreds of performers and workers, dozens of animals, miles of rope and canvas and rigging, a train that stretched across multiple tracks. The big top tent alone covered nearly an acre of ground and could seat between 6,000 and 8,000 people under its canvas roof. That canvas roof is important. It is the center of everything that happened in Hartford. In 1944, wartime material shortages had changed how the circus waterproofed its canvas. The traditional treatment had become difficult to source, so the tent had been treated with a mixture of paraffin wax dissolved in gasoline. This made the canvas resistant to rain. It also made it, in the precise technical language of fire investigators, extremely flammable, catastrophically flammable. The kind of flammable where a single small flame, given the right conditions, would not spread across the tent so much as the tent would simply become flame. The circus had used this treatment before. Nothing had gone wrong. And so the logic that gets so many people killed in so many disasters took hold quietly and completely. Nothing has gone wrong yet, therefore nothing will go wrong. It was a Thursday afternoon performance. The seats were full. Estimates put the crowd between 6,000 and 8,000 people. The vast majority of them women and children, because the men were at work and the boys who should have been growing into men were at war. Mothers with toddlers, grandmothers with grandchildren, older sisters watching younger brothers, groups of children from summer programs brought by chaperones who had thought this was a perfect summer outing. The performance had been underway for about 15 minutes when the fire started near the main entrance, low on the side wall of the tent. A small flame, the kind of thing that, in a different building with a different material, might have been stamped out by a single person with a single boot. A circus employee spotted it almost immediately and grabbed a bucket of water. The bucket of water accomplished nothing. Within the time it takes to read this sentence, the fire was at the roof, and then the roof was the fire. The paraffin and gasoline mixture that coated every inch of that canvas behaved less like a fire spreading across a surface and more like an ignition, simultaneous, total, catastrophic. Witnesses described the ceiling of the tent suddenly glowing, then dripping. Burning wax and canvas began falling from above like a flaming rain onto the people seated below. 6,000 people looked up at the same moment and understood. What happened next was not a panic in the simple sense of the word. It was the physical consequence of thousands of people simultaneously trying to do the only rational thing available to them: get out, in a space that had not been designed with that possibility in mind. The main entrance, where most people's instinct took them, was partially blocked. The circus had a practice of using metal animal chutes, the caged runways through which lions and tigers were guided from their cages to the performance area, and those chutes were still in place across the main exits at the moment the fire started. Because the animal act had just finished and the equipment hadn't been fully cleared. The chutes narrowed the exit to a fraction of its normal width. People poured toward that narrowed opening, and the compression became crushing, and people fell, and people behind them kept coming because the alternative was the fire. The side exits, there were sidewall flaps around the perimeter of the tent that could be opened for ventilation and escape, were not all open. Some were tied shut. Some were not clearly marked. In the darkness and smoke and chaos of 6,000 people in motion, finding a tied canvas flap and working it open was not something most people could accomplish. The bleachers, the wooden tiered seating that rose up around the performance area, had no clear pathways between them. Families who had climbed up to their seats at the beginning of the show now had to climb back down against the flow of thousands of other people, in smoke that was thickening by the second, with burning material falling from above. The tent collapsed in approximately 8 minutes. 8 minutes from the first flame to a collapsed tent covering thousands of people in burning canvas. The fire companies arrived fast. Hartford had a good fire department and the response time was measured in minutes. It didn't matter. There is no firefighting operation that addresses what was happening under that tent in those 8 minutes. The job of the fire department that afternoon was not to fight the fire. It was to find the people underneath what the fire left behind. What they found broke them. The exits had told the story with brutal clarity. At the main entrance, where the animal chutes had narrowed the passage, the bodies were piled. People who had gotten close, who had been close enough to see daylight through the opening, who had been unable to get through. At the sidewall locations where exits had been inaccessible, the same. The fire had moved faster than the crowd, and the crowd had been slowed by every design decision, every cost-saving shortcut, every assumption that the exits would be good enough because they had always been good enough before. Among the dead, the children. This is the part of this story that the people of Hartford could not process and never fully did. The families that had come for joy, that had come for the one afternoon of pure, uncomplicated happiness that a July Thursday in wartime could provide, had brought their children to this. The children who had been most excited about the lions and the acrobats and the cotton candy were the ones who were least able to navigate the exits, least able to fight through the crowd, most likely to be separated from the adult who was supposed to be holding their hand. There is a child who became known in the aftermath as Little Miss 1565. That was the number on her unidentified body in the Hartford morgue. A girl, approximately 6 years old, blonde, found near one of the exits. Nobody claimed her. For months, her photograph was distributed across the Northeast. Parents who had lost children in the fire and had not yet found them looked at that photograph and hoped and feared simultaneously. She was never identified. Not in 1944. Not for decades. The question of who she was and who her family was became one of the longest-running mysteries in Connecticut history. And it carried within it the specific grief of the Hartford circus fire, not just the loss, but the chaos of the loss. The way the fire had scattered families and stolen the ordinary certainty of being able to find your own child. Little Miss 1565 was finally identified in 1991 through the work of a Hartford police officer who had made her case a personal mission. Her name was Eleanor Cook. She was 8 years old. Her mother and brother also died in the fire. Her father had been notified by telegram while serving overseas. He had come home to nothing. The legal and criminal consequences moved quickly by the standards of the era. Several Ringling executives and employees were charged with manslaughter. Some served prison sentences. The circus paid settlements to the families of the dead and the injured, settlements that totaled into the millions of dollars, and that the circus, operating under a court-supervised arrangement, paid in full over several years. The process of paying those settlements was, in itself, unusual. Most corporations in that era fought liability. Ringling, facing the specific and documented horror of what had happened in Hartford, did not. The fire codes that followed were sweeping. Fireproofing requirements for public assembly tents became mandatory and rigorous. Exit requirements were restructured. The specific combination of materials that had treated the Ringling tent was prohibited. Fire inspections for traveling shows became real inspections rather than formalities. The circus itself continued. Ringling Bros performed under canvas for another 12 years after Hartford before finally moving its operations permanently into enclosed arenas. The last outdoor big top performance by the greatest circus in America took place in Pittsburgh in 1956, and people who were there have said that even then, even 12 years later, there was something different about sitting under that canvas roof. A low awareness, a memory that lived in the body rather than the mind. The Hartford Circus Fire is not as well known as some of the other disasters of the 20th century. It did not bring down a building or reshape a skyline. It happened outdoors in summer, in the middle of the afternoon, in a temporary structure that was gone within the hour. There is no architectural remnant, no altered landscape, no physical scar on the city that visitors can point to. What it left is different. What it left is in the codes and the regulations and the requirements that govern every tent, every temporary structure, every outdoor event in America today. The exits you walk past without thinking about. The fire-resistant materials you never see. The capacity limits posted on signs you probably don't read. The inspectors who show up before the event opens and check things you would never think to check yourself. All of that has Hartford in it. All of that has July 6, 1944 in it. And it has the children in it. The ones who came for the lions and the acrobats and left that afternoon for somewhere else. Somewhere their fathers learned about by telegram in places far from home. Somewhere their mothers spent the rest of their lives trying to understand. Joy is not invulnerable. The places we go to feel safe and happy and removed from everything hard require the same vigilance as every other place. Maybe more, because we let our guard down in them entirely. We bring our children. We bring our oldest and most tender feelings. We trust completely because we want to trust completely. Because the whole point of the circus, the whole reason for the big top and the cotton candy and the trapeze artists is to feel for 2 hours that nothing bad can happen here. The paraffin wax and gasoline mixture on that canvas did not know it was the circus. The fire did not understand that the people under it had come for joy. It simply did what fire does when it is given the right conditions and a reason to move. 8 minutes, 168 people, and a little girl whose name took 47 years to find. Eleanor Cook, 8 years old. She liked the circus. Remember her name? Voca Diz, Titulo, 1903, AI Reconstruction. Of the Iroquois Theatre fire, the fireproof building that killed. 602 Titulo, 1903. AI Reconstruction of the Iroquois Theatre fire, the fireproof building that killed 602 Numero Minimo de Palavras, 3.000-102-24 Claude Respondu. Here is your script. Here is your script. On the afternoon of December 30th, 1903, the city of Chicago was exactly where it wanted to be. The holidays were still warm in the air. Christmas had just passed. The department stores still had their decorations up. The streets were cold in the way that Chicago streets are cold, not just temperature, but intention. A wind off the lake that meant business, but that cold made the indoors feel better by contrast. Made the warmth of a heated lobby feel like a gift. Made the idea of an afternoon at the theater feel like exactly the right thing to do with a Wednesday in late December. The Iroquois Theatre had been open for exactly 5 weeks. 5 weeks. It was the newest building in the city, possibly the most beautiful building in the city, and it had been built and marketed and celebrated with one word above all others, a word that the owners had chosen deliberately, confidently, and with what they believed was complete justification: fireproof. That word was in the advertisements. That word was in the press coverage. That word was spoken by the architects and the owners and the city officials who had attended the grand opening and admired the marble, and the gilded ceilings and the velvet seats and the extraordinary size of the place. It seated over 1,700 people. It had asbestos fire curtains. It had a state-of-the-art ventilation system. It had been built with the best materials and the most modern understanding of what a safe public building required. By 3:15 in the afternoon, 602 people inside that fireproof building were dead. It remains to this day the deadliest single-building fire in American history. The Iroquois had everything a theater of that era aspired to be. It had been designed by the firm of Benjamin Marshall, and the result was genuinely spectacular. A Beaux-Arts palace with a lobby that made people stop walking and simply look. The main auditorium rose over 100 feet. The stage was enormous, one of the largest in the city, designed to accommodate the most ambitious productions that touring companies could bring. The seats were upholstered, the carpets were deep, the chandeliers were gas and electric both, glittering and warm. The ownership group had invested heavily and had pushed hard to open before Christmas, because the holiday season was when money was made in the theater business, and they had a headliner that would fill the house, Eddie Foy, one of the most famous comedic performers in America, starring in a musical extravaganza called Mr. Bluebeard. Elaborate sets, hundreds of costumes, a full company of performers and stagehands and musicians. The kind of production that made a new theater look serious, that announced to Chicago that the Iroquois was not just beautiful, but relevant. The Wednesday matinee on December 30th was sold out, more than sold out. The house had been oversold. Official capacity was somewhere between 1,700 and 1,900, depending on who was counting, but that afternoon there were over 2,200 people inside the Iroquois Theater. Children on holiday break, brought by mothers and aunts and older siblings. School groups. Families who had made an afternoon of it. The lobby had been full an hour before curtain, and the ushers had put people in the aisles and along the walls, and in the standing room areas because the show was sold out and people had come from across the city, and turning them away was not something anyone was prepared to do. The fire started in the second act. A spark from one of the arc lights above the stage, the kind of high-powered electrical lamp used to create theatrical effects, caught on a thin muslin curtain hanging in the wings. It was small. It was the kind of thing that stage crews dealt with regularly. A stagehand reached for the fire-retardant curtain, the asbestos safety curtain that was supposed to descend between the stage and the auditorium in exactly this situation, and began to lower it. The curtain jammed. It descended part way, far enough that people in the audience could see it moving, far enough that it created the impression that the situation was being managed, and then it stopped. A guide wire had caught. The curtain hung there halfway down, and the fire on the other side of it continued to grow, and the gap at the bottom of the partially lowered curtain was enough. It was more than enough. Eddie Foy was still on stage when he understood what was happening. By every account of that afternoon, what he did in the next several minutes was genuinely courageous. He stayed on stage. He spoke to the audience directly. He told them to stay calm, to move toward the exits in an orderly way, to not run. He sent the orchestra back to their pit to keep playing, understanding that music might hold the crowd together in a way that silence would not. The crowd did not stay calm. The crowd could already see the fire. What happened in the Iroquois Theater in the next 12 minutes is a sequence of disasters that compound one another in a way that makes each individual failure feel small until you see them together, at which point the accumulation becomes almost unbearable to contemplate. The ventilation system, the state-of-the-art ventilation system that was one of the selling points of the building's safety design, had a flaw. When the fire reached a certain stage backstage, a stage door that opened to an alley was thrown open to allow performers and crew to escape. That open door created a draft. The ventilation system, rather than containing the air movement, amplified it. A fireball, a rolling wave of superheated gas and flame, was pulled through the gap at the bottom of the partially lowered asbestos curtain and into the auditorium. It traveled across the ceiling. The people in the upper balcony, the cheapest seats, the seats farthest from the main exits, the seats where many of the children and the families of modest means were sitting, were hit first and hit hardest. The fireball moved across the ceiling of the auditorium, and the people in the upper levels were inside it before they had time to fully understand that it was coming. Many of them died where they sat. The exits became the second disaster. The Iroquois had exits. It had many exits, more than were legally required by some accounts. The architects had been thorough on paper. The problem was that many of those exits were secured with a type of door hardware called a billet latch, a European locking mechanism that operated differently from the thumb latches that Americans used on interior doors. In a moment of panic, in smoke and darkness and terror, the people who reached those doors and grabbed the handles and pulled found that the doors did not open the way doors were supposed to open. They pulled. The doors held. Some people figured it out. Most did not. The press of the crowd behind them, the bodies of people falling and people pushing forward, meant that even if a single person worked out the mechanism, the door could not be opened against the weight of dozens of people compressed against it from the other side. People died at those doors. Not from fire, not from smoke, from compression, from the weight of the crowd, from the impossibility of moving in a direction that the architecture would not permit. The exterior fire escapes were another problem. Some of them were new and had not yet had their construction scaffolding fully removed. Some of them exited onto enclosed alleys. One set of exit doors on the upper levels opened onto exterior fire escape landings that were several feet lower than the threshold of the door. A drop that, for a panicking person in the dark, was a drop into nothing, into an unknown fall. People went through those doors and fell, and the people behind them followed. In one alleyway adjacent to the theater, a passage that became known afterward as Death Alley, bodies were found piled to a depth of several feet. People who had made it out of the building and had fallen, or been pushed, onto others who had fallen before them. The fire department arrived. The response was fast. It did not matter in the way that fast responses had not mattered in other disasters before and would not matter in disasters after, because the killing was done in the first 12 minutes and no fire department on Earth operates in 12 minutes. From the moment of alarm to full deployment inside a burning building. What the firefighters found when they entered the Iroquois was something that experienced men who had seen fires, who had seen what fires did to buildings and the people inside them, described afterward in ways that made clear they had no previous reference point for it. The auditorium, the seats, the aisles, the stairwells, the landing outside the upper balcony doors. 602 people, in a fireproof building. Chicago's reaction moved through several stages with unusual speed. The grief was immediate and enormous. 602 dead in a single afternoon in a single building was a number that the city could not absorb quietly. The anger followed close behind, and the anger had specific targets because the failures at the Iroquois were not the failures of fate. They were the failures of people who had made specific decisions and had been permitted to make them by a city government that had not done its job. The theater had opened without a certificate of occupancy. The fire suppression systems were incomplete. The sprinklers that had been planned had not been installed. The exit hardware had not been tested by city inspectors who understood how American crowds behaved in emergencies. The overcrowding had not been enforced against. The ventilation system's interaction with a backstage draft had never been modeled or considered. The mayor ordered every theater in Chicago closed the day after the fire. They stayed closed until inspections were completed. The owners of the Iroquois were indicted. The mayor was indicted. Building inspectors were indicted. Almost none of the cases resulted in conviction. The legal system of 1904 was not structured to hold institutions accountable in the way that the public demanded. But the legislative response was different. The public pressure was different. The scale of the dead and the specific documentable, preventable nature of each failure made it impossible to absorb and move on. Panic hardware, the push-bar exit mechanisms that you use every single time you leave a theater or a stadium or a school or an arena, were developed and mandated in direct response to the Iroquois theater fire. Before December 30th, 1903, that technology existed in prototype form, but had not been required. After it, the adoption was rapid, and the mandate spread across the country, and then across the world. Every time you lean into a push bar and a door opens, you are in contact with the Iroquois. You are using a mechanism that exists because of what happened to 602 people in a building that was supposed to be safe. Exit sign requirements. Occupancy limits with actual enforcement. Fire curtain testing standards. Aisle width requirements. The specifics vary by jurisdiction and by era, but the framework, the understanding that a building full of people is a specific kind of responsibility that requires specific kinds of accountability. That framework has the Iroquois in its foundation. The theater was repaired and reopened under a different name less than a year later. It operated for decades. It was eventually demolished in 1956 to make way for an office building. The site is part of a block on West Randolph Street in Chicago that most people walk past without knowing anything about what happened there on a cold Wednesday afternoon in 1903. But the panic bar on the exit door knows. The illuminated exit sign above the stairwell knows. The fire marshal who walks through a crowded venue before the doors open and counts the people against the posted capacity and makes the call that nobody in management wants to hear, that inspector. Doing that job with that authority is doing it because 602 people sat down in velvet seats on the last Wednesday of the year and trusted a word that had not been earned. Fireproof. It is a word that should not exist. There is no such thing. There is only fire-resistant and well-prepared and properly inspected and honestly counted and correctly equipped and thoroughly tested. There is only the hard, unglamorous, unsexy work of making sure that the exits work and the curtain comes down and the capacity is real and the hardware operates the way a panicking human being will actually operate it in darkness and terror. That work is not celebrated. It does not appear in the advertisements. It does not make the building more beautiful or the chandelier more brilliant or the velvet seats more comfortable. It is invisible when it is done correctly, and it is catastrophic when it is not. The people who died in the Iroquois Theater on December 30th, 1903, trusted the word fireproof. They trusted the marble lobby and the gilt ceiling and the 5 weeks of good reviews and the reputation of the architects and the assurances of the owners, and the implicit promise that a city as large and modern and serious as Chicago would not permit a building to be called something it was not. 602 of them were wrong. And because they were wrong, in the specific and documented and devastating way that they were wrong, every public building that came after them was a little bit more honest. Not honest enough. Never fully honest enough. The disasters keep coming, as they always do, as they always will, because the pressure to open before the inspections are finished and to sell more tickets than the fire marshal permits, and to use the cheaper material, and to assume that nothing has gone wrong yet. Therefore nothing will go wrong. That pressure does not end. It is as permanent as the cold wind off the lake. But the push bar is on the door. And that is something. That is 602 people making sure, from wherever they went on that December afternoon, that the door opens when you need it to. Push, it will open.